Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about space and literature. Today on the show, I'm joined by the writer Darran Anderson. Darran is someone who, and as I say to him in this conversation, someone who I followed on Twitter for many years because he posted these amazing images of historical and speculative cities, and they were just fun to look at. What I later discovered is that this Twitter activity, the reason he was posting these images is that this was all research for his various writing projects. Darran's writing interests are wide. He's written about architecture, about design, about video games, about science fiction, about film for places like The Atlantic, Vice, and CityLab. And he is the author of the book Imaginary Cities and the forthcoming memoir Inventory. In this episode, Darran and I talk about his early interest in architecture and love of reading. We talk about his writing process and the themes that he returns to often in his work, as well as how he thinks about audience and playing with the forms and structures of his writing. This is one of those great conversations about the craft of writing and the influence of literature. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles about former guests about design and writing and criticism, as well as previews of upcoming episodes. Scratching the Surface is fully supported by these memberships, so if you would like to help with the ongoing production of the podcast, I hope that you consider joining. Thank you for listening and enjoy this conversation with Darran Anderson. For a long time, admittedly, knew you basically as the guy that posted images of really cool and interesting architecture and like weird cities and kind of speculative design stuff on Twitter. And that's kind of what I knew you as for a long time. And then I don't know when exactly it started, but I guess you probably linked to something that you had written or something. And so then I read that and kind of went down the rabbit hole and have been following your work ever since, trying to read as much of your new work as it comes out as I can, because I find your work interesting in that you are not just the guy that posts the cool stuff on Twitter, but you're writing about everything from the Bauhaus to video games to architecture to music. And I kind of want to start by I guess basically asking, how do you think about your work? What do you call yourself when you describe what you do? How did you kind of arrive at all of this stuff that you're doing right now?
I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what I am really. I yeah,
Okay.
I'm quite good at pointing at things online.
Yeah.
But I guess a writer. I don't even think. I mean, I earn my living in journalism, but I don't really think of myself as a journalist in the traditional sense. I didn't study journalism. I didn't work at a newspaper or anything like that. But most of my work now tends to come about writing in the field of urbanism, I guess, and the sort of intersection of cities with culture, technology, politics, um, psychology, even sociology. So I guess, yeah, I don't like the term urbanist. For some reason, I have a real sort of allergy to phrases like urbanist or flaneur or psychogeographer. All these kind of they just seem so affected. So I guess just a writer who is obsessed with cities, and a lot of the stuff I point to on Twitter, that tends to be stuff that I found during my research for articles and for books. So there is a sort of method to the madness behind the scenes that maybe people don't see. So it tends to be stuff that I chance upon and can't really use. So I just share it online, and hopefully people go down these rabbit holes and find something worthwhile or something inspirational for making games or whatever it is they're working on creatively. But yeah, I guess just a writer who has this kind of cities bug.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that works. Let me ask another question. Let me ask it in a different a different way. I'm curious what I want to kind of go into your background a little bit and maybe how you started writing about this stuff or how you even kind of got onto this beat. Were you always interested in architecture, urbanism, cities, all of this stuff that you are writing about? Or do you come more from a interest in writing and then kind of found yourself writing about these things? You know what I mean? Kind of
Yeah,
which one of those came first for you?
the city's interest came first, really. I remember
Mm,
being a teenager the first time I ever left Ireland. So I grew up in Derry during the Troubles there, and it was quite a grim place at the time. The main architecture that we were exposed to was sort of watchtowers and checkpoints, and occasionally, you get a nice
mhm,
chapel, but there, there was sort of an
mhm,
absence of architecture, and even I wrote a piece
mm,
recently for an architecture magazine, and I was actually a piece about Irish architecture, and the theme that I came back to from those days was iconoclasm, was actually blowing up architecture. That was the prevailing architecture theme of my youth, was watching it explode. So and I grew up with a checkpoint at the end of my street and a watchtower that gazed over all the houses in the housing estate. And there was a sort of there was a curious epiphany that I had. There was this moment where really I hadn't noticed architecture before. I'd been so kind of immersed in it that I hadn't actually appreciated it at all. And then what happened was I was about 18 or 19, and I went on holiday to Barcelona, and it was like the world suddenly turned technicolor after being black and white. It was just this, I couldn't believe the stuff I was seeing, sort of Catalan modernists like Gaudi and Montaner and people like that. This fantastic Art Nouveau, but not just that. I mean, that's spectacular in its own right, and it was incredibly eye-opening. But little things like when I walked around Barcelona at night, all the shops were lit up. They didn't have shutters, and you could see everything lit up and illuminated at night. And it almost had this fairy tale kind of quality, because where I came from, all the shutters came down. It was basically like the city center almost had a curfew. It was just so strange and militarized and depressing. So going to Barcelona was like suddenly I noticed architecture because it was so different from where I came from. And I went back then to Derry. I could see everything afresh. So the first thing I did was immediately apply to do work experience at an architect's office in Derry, thinking that I could be the next Gaudi. And
okay,
within like
nice.
2 weeks, that idea had been thoroughly beaten out of me.
Yeah,
When I was, they were telling me, where do the toilets go in this office block, stuff like that. And I thought I can build all these melting buildings and these fantastical structures. But the
right.
interest in cities and the interest in architecture really took hold at that moment. And for a long time, I couldn't find an outlet for it. So it was a kind of private interest. I got into the writing sort of journalism scene primarily from a literary point of view. So writing a lot about the Irish writing scene and fiction essentially, and editing a lot of like poetry
Mhm,
magazines and that kind of stuff. But there was also another change that happened, which was in the last 20 years, and especially in the last decade, there's been such a massive move. They reckon it's the greatest migration of people of all time, is what's happening in places like China, where there's just a massive movement of people from country areas to cities. And I just
yeah.
found that it was being ignored within literary circles. People were writing these books that were highly acclaimed about the lives of 20 somethings in London, and or
Mhm,
sort of the cliche is always like the English professor who has an affair in Provence on, they,
mhm.
they, they were just picking these ridiculously antiquated subjects. And I was like, why is nobody writing about this stuff? So and if I see it to this day, I see it as a massive failure in the writing community
Yeah, yeah.
that their subject matter is so narrow, and so I felt like I had to go where the interesting developments are happening, and that tends to be. I mean, that's one of the reasons now why everyone I work with is an architect or a designer or a games designer. It's not writers because I feel like they've kind of dropped the ball a little bit. So for the past maybe 6 years, everything I've written has been to do with cities and space.
This is interesting to me because I had the sense, just based on reading your work for the last couple of years, and following you on Twitter and kind of seeing the people that the writers that you write about who have influenced you all come from that kind of literary background. And so I had assumed that the writing actually came first, and that you came from some sort of literature or kind of writing background. And so it makes sense that that was there from the beginning. But what's interesting to me is that you kind of, and tell me if this isn't exactly a right analysis, is that you kind of had this interest in architecture and cities very early on, realized that you maybe weren't cut out to be a designer yourself, found yourself as a writer,
Mm.
started writing and editing, and then it was actually later that you realized that interest, or later that you were able to kind of bring that earlier interest in architecture and buildings and connect it to this kind of new world that you're in as a writer. Does that, would you kind of
I
say
think
that it
that's
took a while?
that's true to an extent. I mean, I definitely feel like a frustrated architect deep down. I would love to be designing buildings, and although they would most likely be monstrous structures, but
Mhm.
yeah, part of me is definitely. But I think almost everyone is a kind of frustrated something. Like I think of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you think of major figures, cultural figures. Like say someone like Bob Dylan, who's regarded Nobel
Mhm.
Prize winner, um, regarded as one of the great singer songwriters, and he kind of secretly wants to be a painter or a poet.
Right,
Even though he
right.
says he's a song and dance
Yeah,
man, there's always this kind of the grass is always greener on the other side. Um, I think
yeah.
the connection, I guess, between the literary and the city side of things is the literature I was drawn to initially was kind of modernism of the 1920s, 30s,
Mhm.
and they a lot of those writers really did deal with the city. They really embraced that metropolitan kind of theme, and
Mhm.
so many books I have on my shelves that are Berlin or St. Petersburg or Dublin or London explored and
Mhm.
reconstructed in literature. And I
Mhm.
feel what happened, I guess, after the Second World War was that literary writers forgot about that and drifted away from it. And the inheritors of that kind of modernist spirit tended to be genre writers, science fiction, for example, or games developers or architects themselves. There are many architects who are
Mhm.
great kind of storytellers in their own right through their buildings. So I feel like, in a way, that literary
Mhm.
writers dropped the baton and others picked it up. And so that's the angle I've always come at it, is that trying to resurrect something of that
Right.
spirit of approaching urban space and its effect on people, because it's a massive it affects all of us who live
Yeah.
in cities, and it just seems to be something that's been overlooked. And there are certain writers these days who do focus in on that, but
Mhm.
it's not thematically as huge as it was at the time of modernism, and it really should be, because it's a massive presence.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is kind of exactly what you were just saying about feeling like the stories that were being told about these cities were so narrow. And what I've always been drawn to in your work is that you tend to cast a wider gaze around all of this. And you are kind of looking at things from a bigger picture, and you're connecting things that don't always at first glance go together. You're kind of going a little bit deeper. You're kind of trying to figure out some new angle on this. A piece I'm thinking of that I reread to prepare for this was where you're talking about the new Blade Runner movie and the countryside and how we think about the countryside. It's just like such an interesting kind of connection between two things, the country and science
Mm.
fiction, and Blade Runner and the city. And what's interesting to me about you talking about these writers and the way they wrote about the city, and what drew me to your work first was not just your subject matter. And I do want to talk about your subject matter, but first was just the kind of formal qualities of your writing, and that you do incorporate. I mean, already you've been talking about your background in this conversation. I feel like your background in your life comes up in the pieces that you're writing. You're kind of sometimes writing in a more fragmentary way. You're kind of playing with the form in the writing itself, the way I think of some of these modern literary writers. And I'd like to talk a bit about kind of how you think about the actual craft of writing and what you kind of took from those writers that you just mentioned from a formal perspective also, because I think there's something really interesting there that you're kind of playing with.
Yeah, well, there's, I guess, the biggest influences on what I'm trying to do is I don't know if they have a name as such as a group. They're a very disparate kind of group, but writers like Borges and Calvino and Umberto Eco.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
while they weren't
Yeah.
necessarily, with the exception of Invisible Cities, they weren't really urban focused writers, but they had a wonderful
Right.
ability to contextualize and to join very random dots and to kind of look at every reverberation of a theme. Now, I realize that that isn't to everyone's tastes, and I've definitely had problems with academics. Uh, Academics tend to hate my writing, and I don't even blame them for it, because if someone is dedicated very rigorously to one, minute theme, um, they're not going to like someone who has a sprawling, fragmentary approach to things. But in a way, I try, when I have conversations with these people, I try and say, look, I'm not an academic for a start, but and I just don't have the brain to do that. My brain is constantly firing in a million directions and making these associations, endless associations. So it's not a headspace I recommend to anybody to have. But I do think that what I'm doing is kind of closer to their work than they might think, because what I'm dedicated to doing now, I think probably and forever, is just to examine urban space and its impact on human beings, and vice versa, from every single angle that I can think of. Every possible
Mm-hmm.
direction.
Mm-hmm.
And those writers that I mentioned, like Calvino and Borges, they did that with sort of literary subjects, or it was kind of writing about writing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm trying to apply it to city. So everything I write about for them, like, for example, will be some kind of angle on a city. I'm just finishing a piece at the moment about signs, and it seems like a very boring subject, but it's actually really, really fascinating when you start delving and making these associations, and doing it across an international scale as well, and across the centuries. So I'm looking at different cultures, and I'm joining the dots, and I'm seeing coincidences and seeing oppositions. So, I mean, the book that I have coming out in February is called Inventory, and it's a book about sort of memoir of
Yeah.
childhood growing up in Derry, but it's really a book about urban space, and I'm looking at that from a child's eye view, but also it's told in a way that's quite like those writers that I mentioned. So it's inspired by a George Perec
Mm.
quote, and he's one of those kind of experimental writers who I tend to chime with. So it's told through objects. Each chapter is a different object, and the sort of object
Oh
is
yeah.
used to tell the story. So rather than write a misery
Yeah.
memoir like many Irish people do, I've tried to do something different. I've tried to, at least have the structure that comes at it from a different angle. So yeah, I'm always borrowing from Borges, Calvino are huge influences. I'm always kind of borrowing from them.
The Calvino influence is the one that I was kind of thinking about as I was asking that question. I have another question about the form and kind of how you think about kind of, I guess, the craft of writing, or even kind of taking these subjects that you're interested in and giving them some sort of shape. And it's interesting to me that you say that
Yeah.
academics don't like a lot of your writing, and I totally get that. But what I also am curious about, and I don't mean to um, I, I I hope I don't say this in a way that's kind of derogatory towards journalism or design writing in general, but I think what you're talking about making connections that aren't always there, or kind of looking for new
Mm.
angles on something, or coming back to the same subject from every different angle, also kind of goes against so much of the grain of what we think we want from journalism. That's so much about like the hot take or the quick reaction to
Yeah.
something. And you are definitely not somebody that's working in that space. I feel like your writing is much
Mm.
slower. It's there's more to it. The pieces of yours that I've read multiple times, I'll pick up things that I didn't pick up the first time. And you're writing for popular websites like The Atlantic, or you've even written for Dezeen,
Yeah.
but you're also publishing books. And I'm wondering, is it a challenge to pitch these stories or to write in this way for those types of publications? Do you find that the book form is better suited for your interest as a writer? How do you kind of think about where your writing goes, or how it will be kind of released into the world?
It's extremely difficult, but it's difficult.
I
It really
thought
is
so.
like it's a constant hustle and it's a constant battle. I mean, like a daily
Yeah.
hustle. But I have very sympathetic editors, especially at the Atlantic, and other kind of culture sites have been very generous. Like Magnum and Freeze, the editors in those places have been
Yeah.
great, and they sort of enable me to do kind of sideways pieces to the urbanist thing, but it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult in books as well. Books aren't really a solution either. I find there is a culture of instant gratification and hot
Mm.
takes, and I mean, all the hot takes are extremely tepid when you actually look at them. They just tend to be the
Right.
orthodoxy, either expressed in a different way or maybe just flipped on its head, which
Yeah.
I find incredibly boring. And I know before I read any of the hot takes what the hot takes are going to be. It's utterly predictable. It totally goes with the the,
Right.
the general
Right.
flow. There's nothing surprising or revelatory, or a lot of the stuff I like to read um,
Yeah.
has a kind of self. I don't know what the word is, but I guess a sort of some level of self awareness and some level of kind of humility almost. I don't like self aggrandizing pieces. I
Mm.
don't like self aggrandizing political stances. And I see that a lot at the moment. It's really tiresome. Trying to cut
Right.
through that when that's the prevalent form at the moment, trying to do something different is an extremely hard sell. And I mean, if I was encouraging younger
Yeah.
journalists, I'm not sure I would. I'd for the sake of their happiness, just maybe go with the flow. Don't necessarily try and like swim against the tide. But
Yeah.
I have been lucky in terms of finding sympathetic publications. But books are a very hard sell too. I mean, I have written about 7 or 8 books that have never come out, and every one of them I think I don't think that Imaginary Cities was. I'm very critical of my own work. So,
Mm.
but people seem to like Imaginary Cities, and there was actually no reason for any of those other books not to have perhaps received a similar audience. But trying to get it through the machinations of
Oh, yeah.
agents and publishers and book fairs
Hmm.
whenever it isn't really what I mean. I've been told repeatedly I wrote a book that was based on a kind of river. I spent like quite a long time writing it. It was a Sebaldian type book about the river that runs through my hometown. And I was told by numerous publishers that, oh, nature writing is over. And I was saying, well, it's not really nature writing, it's about memory. And they were like, no, 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 that's done and dusted. And I wrote two critical
Huh.
histories, one of nighttime. And I was told again, critical histories are out of fashion. Forget about it. So trying to get an audience, it's very frustrating, especially if you know that people will like it. You know that there's an audience there. You can almost demonstrate it. If you do a show of hands online, and there is always the temptation of just doing a Kickstarter or something. But I
Yeah.
don't have the time. With having a kid and stuff, I don't have the time to really do those kind of adventures. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a constant hard sell, and I do feel that a lot of major publications are
Right.
not
Right.
challenging their readers and not actually giving the readers kind of. I think they patronize them a lot. I don't think that they things that would sort of delight and surprise them. They usually give them the new orthodoxies. But I count myself. The fact that I can make a living, however
Yeah.
precarious, from writing is something I dreamed about for 20 years. So, when I was working in call centers and warehouses and places, so
Mhm.
I appreciate being able to do that, but it is a constant hustle. And part of me does think, should I just write
Yeah.
articles about, like, that, I don't know, maybe that way lies madness if I think what would sell well, but I understand editors too. I mean, I have to be slightly sympathetic because I've approached editors with just some ridiculously harebrained ideas to,
Yeah.
like, like writing about. I had this idea that I was going to go around all the. It was sort of contemporary. I wanted to write about sort of dark tourism idea and the sort of voyeurism that's involved in people taking selfies at Auschwitz and that kind of thing. So I read the Stefan Zweig quote, and I think it was 1920, where he was complaining about that on the actual battlefields of the Somme. He was saying that
Mm.
tourists are coming up, by the truckload, and they're not respecting the
Yeah.
fact that this is a mass killing site. Um, and I wanted to go around and to the different places and look at the actual monuments that have been put up because there's such fascinating structures that have been built. There's one that's just a big charnel house full of bones, and it's got like a lighthouse light at the top. And they're incredibly eerie and
Mhm.
amazing places. But in this day and age, pitching something like that, you might as well be pitching, traveling to Mars one way.
Do you think about audience at all when you are pitching stories or when you are kind of in the process of writing? Are you thinking about who might be interested in this? Do you have readers in mind, or is this? It's. I guess kind of what I'm asking is, like I said earlier, I feel like so much of your work is so personal. How do you even think about where this lives, or kind of who else could be interested in this? Do you think about that at all?
No, I mean, the one thing in the back of my mind is that I want to write in an accessible way. So I want to reach as many people as possible. I hate the obscure nature of a lot of academic writing and a lot of even within architecture writing. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of people I admire in the business, but some do write in an extremely elitist fashion,
Yeah.
and it's sort of meant to keep people out. And my intention is to try and reach as many people through accessible language, because I don't think any of the things we discuss
Mhm.
are that difficult, and I think people deliberately they put all this kind of post-structuralist jargon onto things as a kind of masquerade and as a way of and I mean I see people do this a lot when they're talking about power, and ironically
Yeah.
that language in itself is a kind of power structure. It's extremely exclusive. So yeah, I try that. The only consideration I would have is that I try to write as accessible as possible. But I don't think it's healthy to think about an audience because it probably
Mhm.
isn't. It's probably slightly fictitious. You don't really know who's going to read your stuff. I like to think that there's a kind of, I don't know, I think it might have been Toni Morrison who was saying that she wrote books because they were the books she wanted to read and they didn't exist, so she had to write them. There's a sense of, I tend to write articles and books because of that. It tends to be something I wanted to read. Like the piece you mentioned about
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
future
yeah.
of the countryside. I was just looking online and I couldn't find, I wanted to read that piece. Then I had to go, because it was absent, I had to go and write it. And I've been doing that. That's pretty much the basis behind every article that I've written. It's something that I would have loved to have read, and it just doesn't exist.
I want to talk more about that, but I have one other question, just kind of talking about audience and that this idea of accessibility, which I'm glad you brought up, because part of the reason I asked that last question is I was kind of self-consciously feeling like I was making your writing sound really obscure and weird and completely different than everything else out there, which is not what I meant to do. Because that's something that I think is really interesting, is that you are drawing on all of these kind of literary traditions. You're pulling from people like Sebald and Calvino and writing and experimenting with form, but it's all very accessible. And you're writing for places like the Atlantic and CityLab for general audiences. And how do you balance that? I don't know if balance is the right word, but how do you think about kind of, you know, kind of pulling from these, kind of traditions, kind of playing with the craft of writing, but also making it something that is not jargon laden and so weird that no one's going to know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think it helps that I'm kind of self-taught. So
Mm.
I went to university for a little while and sort of did the wrong course. So I was studying law when I should have been studying,
Oh, wow.
yeah, I should have been studying architecture or art history or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
So I ended up, yeah,
Yeah.
it was kind of, there was a kind of social pressure because I came from a working class family. I was the first in the family to get to
Mm.
university. There was a huge amount of pressure and expectation that I was going to be the kind of golden boy. And so I think I kind of got railroaded a little bit
Mm.
into doing a very serious subject. And yeah, you should do law, you should become this kind of human rights. Growing up in a very politicized environment, there was this
Yeah.
sort of pressure to get into like human rights law and stuff. And it really wasn't my character or where my interests lay. So that was a mistake. So really, I dropped out and uh, everything I've learned has been, after secondary school, everything I've learned has been just through reading in libraries, basically. So I
Mm.
haven't
Mm.
learned,
Hmm.
although
Hmm.
I've now learned, critical theory and all the isms, and I've read into them all, and I'm
Yeah.
not very impressed by it. I think universities are wonderful places. I think, however, there is a danger in kind of academic mindset going too far, going too deep into these kind of
Mm.
unnecessarily jargonistic and obscurantist thinking when the ideas themselves, I don't think there's any ideas in Foucault that an average person couldn't understand and already does understand. I haven't been massively impressed by any
Right.
revelation that I've ever read from any of these great godheads. And I read a lot. I mean, I read
Hmm.
Nietzsche a lot, and I read, all the kind of philosophers and everything. I'm really obsessed with Wittgenstein, who is probably the
Yeah.
one
Yeah. Yeah.
exception where I don't understand. I only understand a fraction of what he's talking about, and even that is kind of mind blowing. He's a terrible example. But the rest, there isn't much knowledge that I think,
Yeah.
unless you get into kind
Yeah.
of sciences, and then there is a kind of a objective, uh, they are
Mm.
kind of objectively difficult, or if you're in engineering, there are these things, or if you're a doctor or surgeon or whatever. But in the humanities, I think a lot of it is
Right.
woefully been obscured. So my point of view has always been the kind of amateur autodidact person who's kind of taught himself through books, and that was the way my father learned. So there was a culture of reading, and I think Irish are quite good at that. They're very bookish people, and it's not, the note isn't coming from above; it's coming from the bottom up. So any kind of accessibility that my writing has for taking these kind of big, strange ideas and turning them into something that everyone can have access to. There isn't any thought behind it, really. That's just the way I read, and that's just the way I write. But I do think that knowledge should be open. I've done talks before where most of the talks have been great, and almost all of the panels have been fantastic, and you meet really, really fascinating people. But one or two of the talks I've done with certain professors who are very well respected in the industry and will remain nameless, you get a sense that they're talking to each other over your head on the stage, and that's not just my imposter syndrome speaking. So what happens is they tend to talk to each other, and then I'm talking to the crowd. So there's two different things going on, and I'm much more interested in what the audience has to say than I am with a sort of preaching to the converted, academics talking to themselves, essentially. Because I think there's a lot we can learn, from each other, provided you have that openness and the kind of pluralism that does get lost whenever things get very, very specific.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. I feel like a lot of the origins of this podcast came from that same kind of tension that you're talking about. As somebody who was
Yeah,
very interested in graphic design criticism and graphic design theory, but felt like there were basically uh, two polar opposite camps of people who were thinking and writing about graphic design. There were either the hot take, quick, let's review the logo of the new company
yeah,
people, and I wasn't interested in that, or there were the kind of academics who were really thinking about design at a high level that I found very interesting, but it was very closed off and it wasn't kind of talking to a general audience. And I was wondering if there was
yeah.
some kind of place between that. And that's the space that I'm really interested in, kind of looking at how design is actually kind of affecting the world. And it's not, reserved just for the academy, but it's not just let's talk about the colors of this new logo, but how is this actually kind of like affecting how we live? And I feel like that's so much of also your interest, not just in kind of talking to an audience, but also the things that you're writing about, how these designed artifacts are affecting the real world. And I was thinking about this idea of imaginary cities, and I was thinking about all these kind of speculative and fictional images that you're posting. And I'm wondering if you kind of see those, these quote unquote imaginary cities, or these lost cities or speculative cities or futuristic cities are actually kind of a big metaphor for just cities in general or life in general, and that all of these things are imaginary. That something I always say is that design is ideology made artifact. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on that, and kind of how the built environment influences the way we live and interact in the world.
Well, it has a huge impact, and I think the imaginary aspect is right at the heart of architecture. It's so obvious a truism that we forget it, but every building originated in someone's imagination, and it didn't have to
Yeah,
be there. It didn't have to look like that.
yeah, yeah.
So the entire built environment was once imaginary. So I have a real fascination with looking at sort of renderings and blueprints and ideas that didn't come to pass but could have.
Mm-hmm.
because it reminds us, of
Mm-hmm.
the fictional origins of factual places. And I mean, even like, I mean, there's another sense as well, which is that cities are very subjective places. They're obviously objective places, actual buildings and the streets and the names and everything. But you can live somewhere like London, and there's 10 million different versions of London with all sorts of resonances and all sorts of there are places that mean a lot to people where great life events happened, and they grew up here and this place changed and this place got knocked down, and it becomes a sort of
Mm-hmm.
three-dimensional map of their lives. So it's always good to remember that. I think even from a design point of view, it's extremely good to remember that if you're designing a subway, then you have to design for kind of everyone, old people, people pushing prams, people in wheelchairs. Um,
Right.
and I guess the imaginary component, looking at cities that could have been, there is a sort of element of kitsch to it, and there's an element of just they're interesting to look at, and but I do think there's deeper meanings to it in terms
Yeah.
of questioning. Everything was basically invented by someone, and I seen a really fascinating quote. There was a fascinating line someone said. I don't know how true this is, but someone said
Right.
it on Twitter
Right.
recently that
Right.
the corridor was invented in 1646 or something. Things that we think are innately natural were actually invented, and we should go and learn about these places. There was, I think her name was Lahotsky. She designed the Frankfurt kitchen, and it's kind of the kitchen that most kitchens are now based on. But that was kind of invented by someone, before that. Kitchens were sort of unhygienic, cluttered places, and she rationalized it. But a real interest in delving not just into fantastic things that didn't come to pass, but the things that we believe were always there that weren't actually inevitable or natural. So even things like public parks, people had to really, really fight for clean water, for public parks. In Victorian London, these things or you think of the sort of plague-ridden cities of the medieval times, these were utopian dreams that were eventually realized, in kind of fragmentary utopian form. Even flight. I mean, I'm going tomorrow to uh, stay at the Bauhaus
Oh, nice.
on a pilgrimage. But the idea of getting on a plane for millennia, that was this insanely fantastical dream that people had, and now it's actually so rudimentary that we barely think of it. And we
Mm-hmm.
feel terribly inconvenienced that we can't get Wi-Fi in flights, or we have to sit,
Yeah.
waiting for a plane for an hour or going through security when we're
Yeah.
actually being propelled in this aluminium tube, at 400 miles an hour, you know, however many miles
Yeah.
above the earth. So, there is a complacency that kicks in with design where humans think it was always there. And I think it's maybe a generational thing. I'm of the generation that's probably definitely the last um, generation who knew a time before the internet. So, and before mobile
Right.
phones
Yeah.
and before this kind of instant gratification technology, that be able to have everything instantly. And we were definitely transitional. So I'm kind of Generation X. So we were a transitional generation who were between those two states. And I think generations that are younger now, they've just grown
Mm-hmm.
up with that, to the extent where it seems like it was probably always there.
Right.
And it's good to remind people, it's good to dig and to show people actually here's how it unfolded.
You mentioned this new book that you're working on, and you had mentioned earlier a little bit about how you kind of write things that you want to see in the world, the book that you would want to read, or the article or essay that you would want to read. And I want to talk just very briefly, and hopefully not in too reductive of a way, a little bit about your writing process, because I had read in another interview that you had done that you kind of are just always taking notes. And when you feel like you have enough for a book, you start to
Yeah.
kind of whittle it down. Almost, I was imagining kind of like a sculptor carving, something out of a block of stone. You just kind of, are then reducing it. And it
Yeah.
seems like you always have multiple projects going at once. And I'm kind of curious, hopefully this isn't too reductive. What's that process look like? Are you just kind of constantly
Oh, yeah.
observing things and writing things down? How do you start to then form those into articles or books or projects of various kinds?
It's a horrible process. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's a definite form of neurosis of some kind because it never ends. It never stops, and it's constant. I
Yeah.
mean, I if I go somewhere to escape from it, so sometimes I'll just go to a random place that seems like the most boring place in the world. Uh, and it's say that in the countryside. And the association thing. There's a friend of mine who has a house in Donegal in a place called Kinnigo Bay, and it's kind of quite remote. We walk over the mountain to get to it, and it takes almost 3 hours hiking. And when you get there, there's no phone signal, there's no
Mm.
internet signal, so you're totally away from the world. But the just this cloud of data that surrounds my brain still follows me to these places. So I go to Kinnigo Bay, and then I start reading about the Spanish Armada. Like one of the great galleons of the Spanish Armada sunk there, and there was gold. And then I start reading, start thinking about the Spanish Armada, and then there was a Fenian, an Irish rebel. He set off dressed up as a priest. He escaped. There was a famine rebellion during the famine against the British, and he fled the country from this beach. And so the associations, it doesn't matter where I go, they're constantly bouncing off one another. And um, eventually I've just given in. So one of the reasons I'm going to the Bauhaus, my next book is kind of wrapped up and it's coming out in February. And I thought I'll take some time out and have a few days away and, go and lie on a beach somewhere. And I just gave up and just booked to stay in the actual Bauhaus because I just thought, like, I'm gonna end up writing something, so just to embrace it, just
I love
embrace
that.
the neurosis. But yeah, I write in a weird style. It's very jigsaw like. I just constantly collect notes. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I have the Twitter is
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of where the excess stuff goes. That I'll chance in a quote that doesn't fit in text writing, so I'll just put it on Twitter. Just
Mm.
maybe come back to it
Mm-hmm.
later. Twitter's quite a good way of remembering, actually.
Yeah.
I'm not selfish with it because I use it. If I'm thinking of a theme, I will go through what I've posted for the past few years, and there's often a lot of material there. But yeah, it's a sort of jigsaw, and then a massive
Right.
amount of notes. So the original draft, this isn't even the notes. The original draft of Imaginary Cities was almost 2,000 pages long, and then yeah, the actual draft. So we had to get that whittle that down, and even you know with leaving
Oh,
entire chapters
wow.
out.
Okay.
And the original form of it was supposed to kind of be like walking through an
Jeez.
actual city, and I had to ditch that as well because it was just huge. Like it
Yeah.
was unpublishable, but it was kind of like an arcades project thing. It was not even
Mm.
really a book. It was you carried it around in a bag. It was just this massive
Yeah.
sprawling manuscript that was completely unpublishable. But
Right.
so I've never been happy with Imaginary Cities because I know that there was a better book there that never came out.
Yeah.
So, but people are kind about it, and that's a nice thing. So, but yeah, it's collect a huge amount and then whittle it down, and it is kind of like a sculpting. You end up some form at the end
Yeah.
that you don't really recognize as yours, but it looks like a book, so it must be a book.
Something that's come up again and again in this conversation is how wide your interests are. I was interested in what's next for you. What are the other subjects that you are thinking about writing about? maybe things that you haven't written about that you want to write about. It sounds like the answer is just everything, but are there things that you're kind of especially excited about right now?
There's everything's going to be about space, and I know that's a very vague kind
Mm.
of term, but I do have a fascination with the spaces in which people live. And there's a book that's always kind of haunted me, guest and bachelor book called The Poetics of Space. And
Oh
really,
yeah.
yeah, that was a huge influence in inventory because it's all, and Nabokov was as well, because they read from a kind of
Mm.
child's eye view of rooms and attics and wardrobes that you climbed into, and all kind of the
Mm.
mystery of spaces
Hmm.
whenever you're small. So basically, yeah, inventory is a spatially obsessed kind of book, and the architecture of tyranny is obviously entirely about space. So I'm on this theme forever now. There's no getting away from it, and I would just like to kind of look at different,
Yeah.
uh, different themes within that structure. So one of the things I wanted to do, and it's been technologically more difficult than I realized, I want to do a podcast. Um, about themes of architecture and space. And the themes initially, one was the first one was I've got the kind of notes for the episodes written. So the first is about the idea of home, childhood, and where you grow up and the impact that that has. And the second one's about death, and so execution
Oh,
sites. So
interesting.
and burial sites and the monuments that we put up in various different
Huh.
religions to the dead. And the third was going to be faith. So looking at all the different religions and going to different holy places and
Mm.
that's something I'd really like to do. I'm not sure it'll either come out as a podcast
Yeah.
or perhaps as a series of books or even articles. If I find a willing editor, I'd love to do it as a series of articles. But
Mm.
just looking at thematically at these themes within a wider kind of architectural perspective, but really
Yeah.
looking like microscopically kind of examining the themes of human life really, but the places where they happen. I don't think we do that enough. I think the places that we inhabit have a massive impact on how we live and why we believe what we believe. And so I'm going to take a tape recorder to the Bauhaus tomorrow and try and record some material inside the buildings and try and fit that in. So really, it's all about I've gone around a lot of cities and the strange spaces that have great acoustics and things. So I would like to try and do something along those lines and um, maybe film a few things. But it's always going to be space related and always going to be the how we inhabit spaces with stories,
Yeah.
and then how the space itself kind of inhabits us. We carry around the memories of like childhood places, and we carry around these fantasies of what we one day might own or visit, and there is
Yeah.
something quite dreamlike about it, but something intrinsically everyday as well. I love going to places like Venice. Venice was a huge kind of presence in imaginary cities in the background, via Calvino. But I love the fact that it's this simultaneously an incredible, fantastical place. You just can't believe how coming in through on a boat
Mm.
through the mist at
Hmm.
nighttime to an empty St. Mark's Square, and it's all ghost lit with these. It almost looks Victorian, the light, and it's basically a city in the middle of a lagoon. How does it exist? But then at the same time, if you sit in the canals in the daytime and
Yeah.
sit by the canals, and you can just watch people go by, with supplies for the shops and workmen going places, and it's so functional as well as a place. It's simultaneously fantastical and extremely functional, and I love examining these spaces from every possible angle. So I'm basically doomed to cities forever,
Yeah.
like some kind of wandering ghost.
No, I love that, actually. I actually think that in a weird way that this brings this whole conversation full circle. We started talking about space and this kind of blending of genre of your writing and playing with form, and or kind of ending talking about that also. Um, I thought this was such an interesting conversation. I'm a fan of your work. I love the way you think about these things. I try to read everything that you publish, and really enjoyed getting to kind of talk to you about how you think about all of this. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Jarrett. It's been a pleasure.
This episode was recorded on August 16th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.